Hello and welcome to Dollars and Cents, the Australia Institute podcast where we explain just what the hell is going on in the economy. I'm Greg Jericho, Chief Economist at the Australia Institute and your usual host of Dollars and Cents. Unfortunately, Eleanor is not here with us, but I'm going to run through what we're doing today. Now, it's all about tax. Tax doesn't just affect markets, it shapes our society. On housing, excessive tax concessions, namely the capital gains tax discount and negative gearing, have driven up prices, concentrated wealth, and locked many out of the market.
Authors of a new report into the rental market say Australia's housing crisis is the worst it's ever been.
Young Australians are feeling hopeless about the future, with 4 out of 5 aged between 18 and 24 expecting to be worse off financially than their parents.
It's my view that John Howard did more than anyone to make housing unaffordable, through reforms like cutting capital gains tax in half.
Now, there's this huge group of people who don't want to be renters. They want to be homeowners, and the only reason they're renting is because they're trying desperately to save up for a deposit in order to buy a house. And house prices keep increasing faster than their incomes.
This is denying people safe and affordable housing, and it's had a devastating effect on their lives. It degrades social cohesion and the fabric of Australian democracy. On this special episode, we're bringing you a discussion from our recent Revenue Summit at Parliament House in Canberra. Amy Remeikis, Australia Institute Chief Political Analyst, hosted a panel of 3 leading voices calling for housing reform. Maiy Azize is the national spokesperson for Everybody's Home, a national campaign to fix the housing crisis. Jordan van den Lam, perhaps better known as Purple Pingers on social media, is a housing advocate behind the popular Shit Rentals database. And Josie Lee is Policy and Advocacy Lead at Oxfam Australia, a charity dedicated to tackling inequality to end poverty. They discuss the origins of Australia's housing crisis and what governments should be doing to fix it. We start the discussion with Maiy providing her assessment of what governments are currently doing, or not doing, about the crisis.
I think it's a great question, and it's a great place to start, because one of the pet peeves that I have is hearing people say that the government isn't doing anything on housing. We're in the midst of a historic housing crisis. Why isn't the government doing something? The government is taking a lot of action. It's taking exactly the wrong kind of action, and this is where Australia's housing crisis comes from. So Australia had a long period where homes were affordable to rent and to buy. And back in that era, the government had a fairly sensible approach to dealing with housing affordability, like other countries, comparable countries. The government built homes and then rented them to people and also sold them to people. And that is a really, really big part of why housing was affordable in Australia for a very long time. At the high point in 1956, about 1 in 4 new builds in Australia was being built by the government. And right up until the early 1980s, about 1 in 3 renters in Australia was renting from the government. And that's really, really important, because when you look around the world at the countries that have either turned their housing crises around or managed to avoid having a housing crisis altogether, they are countries where the government is a major supplier of housing. There is not a country in the world that has fixed their housing crisis without the government playing a major role in housing supply. What we saw in the 70s, 80s and 90s was that approach completely flipped on its head. So the government massively stepped back from providing housing. It was seen as a problem to solve that there were so many people living in public housing who were working. So there was a big poverty inquiry in 1975, and there was a chapter on housing, and a big part of it was about how it's really poorly targeted. There are all these working people in public housing. They shouldn't be there. And we saw the government introduce things like Commonwealth rent assistance, really step back from providing public housing. And we saw negative gearing formalised in 1987. We saw the capital gains tax discount introduced in the late 1990s. And so what we see now is the government actually spends an enormous amount of money on housing, an enormous amount of money on housing, in the order of between $13 and $15 billion a year, depending on when you look at it. And it's the capital gains tax discount, its negative gearing deductions, and its Commonwealth rent assistance. They spend a fraction of that building homes. So that's what the government is doing.
And Jordan,
Menzies wanted to turn us into a nation of little capitalists. What's been the result of that?
He did a good job, I guess. Yeah, it looks great. There's I don't even know where to start. Been talking about this since like 2021. It's certainly not gotten better. But also to jump back to your previous question, you asked what the government's doing. And yeah, as Maiy said, heaps. Like the Victorian Labor government is demolishing every single, 44 towers of public housing in Victoria. The federal government's introducing policies that will increase the price of housing for everyone else. And, Labor governments all over the rest of the country are privatising public housing. So yeah, like they are doing heaps and heaps and heaps. And it's just all just terrible.
And Josie, I mean, how do you see what the governments are doing in housing? And you've also said that our tax system is fueling inequality. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so Oxfam is obviously not a housing agency, but our core business is focusing on inequality. And what we're seeing today is a system in Australia where we're failing to tax wealth. And we're giving a lot of concessions and tax breaks to people who that disproportionately benefit people on the highest incomes. So I could talk to you about the capital gains tax for a moment.
We love that.
So there's a couple of problems with this tax. Firstly, 85% of the benefit of the capital gains tax goes to the wealthiest 10% of people. The tax discount, my apologies, to the wealthiest 10% of people. 50% of the capital gains tax discount goes to just 24,000 people who earned over $1 million. So these people are on average $271,000 better off because of this discount. So this is a tax discount that is really driving inequality, but that's not all it's driving in Australia. It's driving the housing crisis. Negative gearing and the capital gains tax work together to really incentivise looking at property as an investment rather than a home. And it's been driving up prices. And I think ACOS and Australia Institute have done a lot of research to show the kind of mutually reinforcing impact of these taxes have had on driving up housing prices. So if we really want to tackle the growing inequality problem in Australia, but also the housing problem, scrapping capital gains tax discount would be a critical place to start. And if the government did that last year, they would have saved about $22 billion. So it's a winner if we want to address some of these big problems today.
As senior economist at the Institute, Matt Grundoff often says property speculators are literally betting on the housing market continuing to go up because that's how they make their money through the capital gains tax. Negative gearing, you have to make a loss in order for you to receive the tax benefit, whereas capital gains, you need your property to increase in value extensively in order to cash in as a property speculator. It seems so easy to tackle as an issue. It's out of control. We knew as early as 2004 that it was having a terrible, devastating impact on housing prices. John Howard received a submission from Treasury, which basically said, yeah, things aren't going great. Maybe you should look at this. And he just was like, no, because all my battlers won't vote for me if their property prices suddenly drop. We now know that their grandchildren can no longer afford to buy houses, and increasingly older Australians who do not have home ownership or do not have large retirement savings and super are also being completely priced out of the market. So Maiy, why is it so difficult to shift the population on things like capital gains tax discount in particular?
I'm not sure that it's as difficult as we think it is. In my capacity as spokesperson for Everybody's Home, we've commissioned polling quite a few times, but we've seen polling come out quite a few times over the past couple of years. Guardian Essential has done several polls on which measures are most supported to tackle the housing crisis. There's been research from Galaxy, and it's really consistent. You either have about half of the population supporting it or close to half, and you've only got about 15% of people who really consistently oppose, and you have other people who are sort of open to it, which is pretty pretty amazing, actually, when you consider we've had like no national leadership from either major political party for the past couple of years. Imagine how much more support we could have if we actually had some leadership. The issue that we have with many of the reforms that we need for housing, whether it's better protections for renters or whether it's tax reform, is that the people who support change are not people who have political power. And so you have a debate that's dominated by a small number of people who have a disproportionate, an enormous amount of power. And what we need to do is build a political constituency of people who want homes to actually live in and not homes to invest in.
And on that, as Richard Dennis often likes to remind me, if you look at the 2019 Labor election review of how people voted, which is often where people get this idea that we can't touch negative gearing or capital gains because Labor lost the election on it. But he points out that when you look at the numbers, the top 10 earning electorates in Australia swung to Labor that election by, about 4%, and the bottom 10 earning electorates swung against Labor by about 4%. So it kind of, cancelled it out. But you would think on those numbers that the people who actually would stand to lose the most financially were actually in favour of the policies. So, Jordan, why do you think that there is such a lack of political bravery around this? And why does it trigger so many politicians when you come out and basically you're advocating for housing for all? And it might be at times in inflammatory language, but hey, this is the age of the internet and that's how we get people's attention. So why does it trigger politicians when they see people starting to follow your message?
I think it's a good question, and there's a number of reasons, and like I don't even think the main reason is because they're all property investors. I think even if they were excluded from having investment properties, they would still be beholden to like quite a significant portion of our economy, which is like make housing number go up. That's what it's built on at the moment, and I think there is an element of it that is I'm scared of how. If I actually do anything substantive to address the housing crisis, at the core of which is houses are too expensive, and make that number go down, I will lose votes. I think it is like that is a genuine concern for them. And, instead of actually doing something about that, they would prefer to just keep the votes. Meanwhile, people are dying, and they will have to do something. Or else we will have to do something.
Josie, you've advocated, or Oxfam has advocated previously for a wealth tax, which, it might be another way around directing this that doesn't necessarily come at the political cost, and I put that in inverted commas, of doing something with the tax system as we currently have it. So a wealth tax on the country's richest 0.5% of households, how many families does that actually capture in Australia, and how much do you think it would raise in revenue?
Yeah, so Oxfam has been advocating for a wealth tax. We saw it earlier today in some of the presentations. Australia does not tax wealth. We had inheritance taxes in the past, which were all dismantled. And right now we have a situation of a huge growth in billionaire wealth. So just to contextualize my answer, we have over the past decade, the number of billionaires in Australia has grown from about 74 to 161. Their wealth now, over the past decade, grew by about 160%. So they now collectively have a wealth in the top 200 people in Australia have $670 billion together. So we see it in the richest 0.1% of people in Australia. They also, their wealth is growing much, much faster than the lowest income earners. They have 189 times more wealth, and it's growing 6 times faster than the bottom 50% of people in Australia. So we do have this situation where we have this huge growth in extreme wealth. And an economist called Gabriel Zucman from France estimated that the billionaires have an effective tax rate of 0.3% of their wealth. So they are notorious tax avoiders. And this has come up and is being talked about on the global stage now with the development of a new UN tax convention, which is currently being negotiated. And there's a couple of big targets in that negotiation, and it's the multinational corporations who are shifting profits around the world to avoid paying their fair share of tax, but also billionaires are definitely in the sights of many nations who can see that these are some of the biggest tax avoiding groups out there. So in Australia, if we wanted to halt the growth of billionaire wealth, and that's something that Oxfam firmly believes we should be doing, because we do think there should be a limit on the amount of wealth that any one individual can amass. So the growth rate of billionaire wealth over the past 5 years has been 5% growth rate. So if we applied a 5% wealth tax to just billionaires in Australia, that would be 161 individuals. We could raise around $33 billion, give or take. So it's a simple tax measure. It's a panacea. It avoids the complications of reforms in various different areas, and it would really start to bring Australia back to a much fairer system and bring down this massive growth we have in billionaire wealth.
But Josie, have you considered that it might make them sad? Jordan, we're seeing immigration being blamed for Australian house prices, and we now have people who are marching in the streets using that as one of the reasons to end migration and immigration in Australia. What is your response to that, particularly since Melbourne has been such a flashpoint for this part of the conversation?
It's really quite stressful and yeah, I've been to a bunch of the the anti-racist rallies and seeing them afterwards go around and just in little groups and just literally pick someone who's not white and hit them, assault them at the shopping center while they're there with their family and stuff. It's disgusting. And yeah, we're doing the same thing that we've always done throughout history, which is blame someone who doesn't look like you for the evils of the rich in this country. Except, yeah, it's having real consequences already, and we really need to fight back against this. And they're wrong, they're lying on all of their points, and the Australia Institute has done some really good research on exactly why they're lying. But instead of pushing back against this rhetoric, we're seeing Labor capitulate to the talking points. There's some good people at both rallies or whatever. Thank you, Alvo, for that one. And then look at what the Liberals are doing at the moment. We know where this leads, and yeah, we really have to do something about it, quite frankly.
And Maiy, why do you think so many people are open to the message about being angry about migration and population growth, but not about the number of empty homes or even, temporary rentals and holiday rentals like Airbnbs?
I think the problem that we've got is we've got a political and media class that isn't assigning responsibility for the housing crisis where it belongs. If you pick up a newspaper or you listen to a politician talk about the housing crisis, you would think that this is like a weather event, it's happening. The government's just sort of trying to navigate it, as opposed to something that is the direct result of government decisions. We talked before about how government used to make really deliberate decisions to provide homes to people, and now it makes really deliberate decisions to basically prop up investors. It's really interesting. We've got a discourse now that says that the people who are profiting from the housing crisis are actually the solution to the housing crisis. We should be doing, more to support them and remove guardrails from them. But that is a massive problem, because people who are out there talking about, or people who benefit, I guess, from this discourse around migration are people who oppose all of the real solutions. They oppose making a really big investment in public and community homes. They oppose doing things that are politically difficult around the tax system. And when people don't understand what the cause of the actual crisis is, they go looking for another cause. And so I think it is really important for those of us who are campaigning on housing to tell a better and more resonant story, but also the truthful story, the real story.
And it's not entirely true that the government's not building housing. We are building it for US and UK soldiers who are coming here to do AUKUS things, just not building it for perhaps Australians who need it. Okay, we'll open up to questions.
A basic question. Would someone be able to tell me how many beds were estimated to be in Australia, say, 10 years ago in the population, the number of beds, say, before COVID and the population, the number of beds after COVID and the population. Do we have a housing problem or do we have a bedding problem?
I think this is a really interesting framing. It's I- I'll start with the number of homes. I couldn't tell you about the number of beds, but we do know that the number of homes per person in Australia has been going up at every census since we have records. So since the early 90s right through to now, the number of homes per person continues to go up. So in some ways, when you look at it, the supply story in Australia is actually going pretty well, especially when you look at us compared to other countries per adult, because we've got a much younger population than a lot of other comparable countries. It's a lot of you wouldn't know it, but the supply story in Australia is actually going pretty well.
Yeah, Matt Grundoff often tells me that over the last 10 years, give or take a year, population in Australia has increased by 16% and housing stock has increased by 19%.
Yeah. The issue that we have is that the homes that we've got are more unfairly distributed than they've ever been. And I think that is another way of phrasing this. Oh, we don't have enough bedrooms, or the bedrooms that there's extra space. It's fascinating because we don't talk about income that way. We don't say, oh, there's a bit of a mismatch. Some people have got a bit more income and other people just don't have as much. What you're describing is actually inequality. We've got higher income. We actually spoke about this at dinner last night, me and Josie and Jordan. Higher income households are getting smaller, and medium and lower income households are actually staying the same size or getting bigger. So that's inequality.
And some of that bed conversation was driven by former RBA Governor Phil Lowe, who came out after the pandemic and said one of the reasons for housing prices increasing is because people don't want to live or rent with other people anymore. They want their own space, and it kind of took off like wildfire. Whether or not there was data behind it at the time is questionable.
Thank you for your presentations, but I wish you would distinguish between state and federal government, because they have very different roles in housing, financing and supply. But my question is to ask each of you, people seem to forget that back in, I think it was 1985, Keating introduced the capital gains tax. We then had the concessions on it. But pre-Keating, there wasn't any capital gains tax. So what we need is a brave treasurer or a brave minister to do something. If each of you were the minister, what's the one thing that you would do?
Josie, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, well, I think I've already sort of said it. I think for me, a wealth tax would be the number one priority. And I would extend it to not just billionaires, but to people in the top 0.5%. Perhaps, people who have tens of millions of dollars, or indeed hundreds of millions of dollars, as well as billionaires. And I would do this because I think it's the most kind of extreme example of, it's extreme wealth in our country. I don't think that any one person should have hundreds or thousands of times more wealth than an average person. And I think that it's a simple source of revenue that could be redistributed to the things that we all really need. It could be, during COVID, I think it was about $20 billion was spent on raising income supports, and meant that finally income supports were above the poverty line in Australia. So a simple wealth tax could pay for that. It could virtually eradicate poverty between investment in income supports and housing. We can do this. We do not have to have poverty in Australia. There is no good reason for it. We have the wealth, and a wealth tax is a good way of raising the revenue we need to address it. So I would say Oxfam has conducted polling on this, and 72% of Australians support introducing a wealth tax on billionaires and the super rich, and 68% of those people support using that money on poverty alleviation measures such as affordable housing and income support.
Which makes it all the more ridiculous that Labor folded on the super changes that impacted 88,000 people. Yes. Jordan?
I just want to talk about like the framing of the question by when you said, I wish you could distinguish between state and federal government responsibilities. They're already doing that. They're already telling us like, oh, that's a state responsibility from the federal government. Local councils are being like, oh, that's a state responsibility, and the state government's like, oh, the federal government's not giving us any money, so we can't do anything. All three levels of government can do something, and none of them are doing anything. Like local councils can ban Airbnbs, short stay accommodation, change planning regulations so that like any big developer or development has, a percentage of it be public housing that private developers have to pay for. State governments can do a whole, like most stuff actually. And the federal government, like we can delegate responsibilities to the federal government. Victoria just did it with our industrial manslaughter or like work, like wage something or other. We can do that, and we have done it in the past. Like all three levels of government can actually do something. And I guess putting aside the question of what a socialist taking up a ministerial position and running capitalism, if I were to do that, I definitely wouldn't stop at one thing. Like I'd hope if that ever came to be, we'd be well past the, getting rid of the capital gains tax discount and all that kind of stupid stuff. But I'd be really keen to seize empty homes and redistribute them. And if we're not at that level, perhaps just tax them heaps, build public housing, freeze or cap rents or whatever. There's just so much we should do. And like from a tax perspective, like not only should we not give people who rely on building their own wealth by exploiting others tax concessions, we should be taxing them punitively, like heaps more, because it's evil what they're doing. They're exploiting others for their own wealth.
I was talking to someone recently who's having to look for a new rental property in the Canberra market, which is just, the seventh circle of hell for anyone who's had to do it. And the reason that they're having to move is because they have young children, and there's currently vines growing into the living room of the rental property that they're in. And they had asked the landlord to fix it and was told, oh, we're sorry, you're on our list and you're down on the priorities, because their landlord owns 24 homes in Canberra and is having trouble balancing all of those maintenance requests. So, it is an absolute distribution problem. But Maiy, what would you do if you had the power of government?
Well, thanks for the
benevolent
Yeah,
dictatorship.
thank you for the question. It's a great question. We've met before, and it's nice to see you again. I think the biggest and most profound thing we could do, I said it before, I'll say it again, build public and community housing. There is no country in the world, I really cannot stress this enough, that has fixed housing without the government becoming a supplier of housing, a major supplier of housing. They might do it in different ways. There are different models, but that is the common denominator. And, to speak about the distinctions between different levels of government, the most profound change that we've seen in the past couple of decades has been the federal government stepping away from funding homes and deciding it's other people's responsibility. When you look at the amount that the government spends per person providing housing, it has plummeted since the early 80s. It is the most profound change that we've seen, and a lot of the other changes that we've seen, state governments selling off, outsourcing, tightening eligibility criteria, all of that is in response to the scarcity.
That's where we'll leave this week's discussion, which was recorded as part of our Revenue Summit on Wednesday, the 29th of October. If you want to find out about all our research, events, webinars and more, you can become a subscriber to our newsletter. It's free, and you can sign up via the link in the show notes. We've also just launched our latest Vantage Point essay, Aiming Higher, Universities and Australia's Future. It's by Western Sydney University's Vice-Chancellor, Professor George Williams. He argues that Australian universities are not living up to their mission. In the essay, Professor Williams lays out why fixing universities matters, not just for our economy, but for Australian democracy. You can buy this edition for just $19.95 or become a Vantage Point subscriber and save $15 over 4 issues and get free shipping. Buy it now at australiainstitute.org.au/store or via the link below. As ever, our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Greg Jericho. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next week.